Welcome back, everybody. We are covering a lot of different cases and stories here on the network today, and one of them is the Donald Smith case, and this case is out of Florida. We covered it earlier this week when Donald Smith was convicted. It's nice to say it. He was convicted, found guilty of the kidnapping, sexual battery, that's rape, and first-degree murder of Cherish Periwinkle. 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle, and beginning on Tuesday begins his sentencing phase. What will happen to him? Will he face the death penalty or potential life in prison? That becomes the question for that Florida jury. What I want to play for you right now is the jailhouse audio recording. For anybody who followed this case, Donald Smith was caught on tape talking to another inmate, bragging about what he did and his proclivities towards younger women. Just listen to the hubris of this. We'll play it right now.
Here they come. No one in the back.
Detective Carter, the voice that you just heard that said the one in the back, is that the inmate who was housed directly adjacent to the defendant, Donald Smith?
Yes, sir.
Man, did that bitch turn around, man. These are young girls, you hear me? They're young, man. But man, when you look at this girl's ass, you're like, whoa. You know how old they are? About 12, 13. But this one got an ass like Coco Weed. You can see the wine glass on her ass.
The second voice that's on that recording, is that the voice of Donald Smith?
Yes, sir.
Okay, the person who said they're about 12.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You still think she's 12? Yeah. That's right in my alley right there. That's my target area right there. That's what I go after. Well, you have fun with that one.
Officer Carter, the person who said, that's my target area, that's what I go after, whose voice is that?
The defendants.
You still think she's 12? Yeah. That's right in my alley right there. That's my target area right there. That's what I go after. Well, you have fun with that one. See, her officer would be ashamed, you? Yeah. Letting that girl run out looking like that, man, with fake eyelashes, fake fucking nails, fake hair, fake titties probably. Yeah, I like to run into her at Walmart.
Officer Carter, the voice that just said, I'd like to run into her at Walmart, is that the voice of the defendant?
Yes, sir.
That hair is ridiculous. Straight fucking ridiculous. Cherry has a good on her? Yeah? Damn, boy.
Let me just inquire, the voice that we just heard that said, Cherish have some butt on her, that was not this defendant, correct?
Yes, sir.
That was the other inmate in the adjacent cell.
Yes, sir.
ain't acting like that though. That's because she ain't black. She had a lot for a white girl.
The last voice that was depicted there that said, because she ain't black, but she had a lot for a white girl, was that the voice of this defendant?
Yes, sir.
Officer Carter, this recording was made 2 years after the defendant was arrested, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I don't have any further
No
questions.
matter how many times that I hear that, it's equally as chilling every time. And stupid. His head, denying that it even happened, or how stupid was he to even say this?
I know. First of all, I agree with you that it was extremely difficult to listen to. And secondly, I remember as a young attorney sitting and listening to jailhouse recorded telephone calls for hours, because it clearly states when you pick up the phone, this is being recorded. So yes, the stupidity of these inmates never fails to amaze me. It was also interesting, his physicality, his tells. What I found disturbing actually was watching his bodily reaction to listening to that audio, seeing his reaction, seeming that he agreed with it. He was unable to keep still. It was almost like, was he being aroused? It was extremely disturbing.
So Emily, why I bring this up, or why it's good you're bringing this up, is because some people have said who've watched him is that he's proud of what he did. This is hubris. And in fact, he asked the court photographer at one point to pose for a photo. He posed for a photo. It's almost like it's his spotlight, and he's proud of what he did. I could be speculating here, but isn't that one way of looking at it? I'm sure you've had clients, or you know about people who have had clients before, who are actually proud of what they did.
Totally. First of all, that's not uncommon. There's absolutely a hubris associated with a lot of these premeditated crimes, or here where there's a sense of gratification. And as you noticed in the audio too, we heard him blaming someone else, right? The mother should be ashamed letting her daughter go out looking like that, right? He's definitely almost saying she deserved it, or what do you expect is going to happen, right? This is kind of the mindset, again, of, yes, a very judgmental, extremely egotistical person that is now basking essentially in the limelight, right? This is totally his day, which is all the more frightening and disgusting. And again, the jury came to a conclusion within 15 minutes. This guy's guilt was absolutely sure. We had the medical examiner break down on the stand because the injuries she was describing were so horrific for this poor little girl here. For someone that is a scientist and physician by nature, right, this is really rare. I really rarely see that level of emotion conveyed by a clinician and someone who's dedicated their life to this kind of forensic pathology. So that right there, all of this stuff is dovetailing into the fact that it was an easy and simple conviction for this jury.
Yeah, it's chilling. We show the photos of it, him lurking with her in the Walmart. It is just so disturbing. And you correct me, you can bring evidence back that you had in trial that you would bring in the penalty phase, correct? So would they probably replay this audio recording?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's interesting here too is he is facing the death penalty, right? And I'm not quite sure what defense is going to bring forth in terms of mitigating factors, frankly, because certainly the things that he was bringing up in that audio wouldn't fly in the face of a jury, right?
Yeah, Emily, let's talk about that in depth when we come back. I want to talk about the mitigating factors, the aggravating factors. Let's really get into the death penalty discussion so we can have a full discussion about it before the break. So Emily, stand by. Tuesday, as we keep talking about during the sentencing phase, what will happen to this man who was convicted of a horrific crime? And you hear him bragging there, just unbelievable. We're going to go to a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back, everybody. We are covering the Janet Solander case out of Nevada. It will begin at around 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so we want to reflect on what we know about the case and what happened yesterday when the trial began with the opening statements by both the prosecution and the defense. And we heard the testimony from a caseworker who uncovered the abuse that these three children were alleged to have suffered. Again, Janet Solander is facing 46 counts of child abuse, including sexual abuse, physical beatings, we have burnings, extreme and cruel punishment, and humiliation in relation to three foster children that she and her husband, Dwight Solander, later adopted. I want to bring in right now criminal defense attorney Emily Campagno. Emily, great to have you back.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Jesse.
You're a great criminal defense attorney. So when you hear these allegations, and these are pretty outrageous allegations, I mean, the level of abuse, if true, is horrendous. It is so difficult to hear about. It's so chilling. How do you defend it?
I know it was honestly difficult to read the complaint. So first of all, my heart goes out to these children. Obviously, this is a situation where it seems, especially on its face, that the state failed these kids after numerous complaints and calls were made to them without activity. Now, defense here is going with, look, these kids had issues, and these parents, these began foster parents and then adopted them. So the adoptive parents were not equipped to handle the medical issues and the host of other emotional issues that these girls had. So they're really coming in actually with saying this was kind of out of their control, that there was so much that they inherited with these girls in terms of their diet and their digestive system that contributed to the fact that they were essentially just inadequate caregivers. But unfortunately, this goes in stark contrast with the fact that those parents maintained that they were not only equipped to handle them because Janet Solander, the mom, alleged that she was a nurse, even though that was fabricated, but also they wanted to adopt 4 more special needs children. Moreover, as we're now discovering, those issues in large part stemmed from the fact that the kids were malnourished, abused, and were prevented from toileting appropriately. So unfortunately, it's a complete spiral where their medical issues were frankly the result of the abuse. And, you know, in no way would I claim to defend this strongly. Here, the defense team is kind of taking whatever they can get, frankly.
Well, the defense seems to be saying that it's not true, that the allegations that you've heard, what the prosecution has said, it's just not true, that the kids are making this up. But Emily, you've heard the expression, you can't make this stuff up. I find that some of these things are so outrageous that will that be enough for a jury? I mean, it just started, the case just started, but to make this stuff up, is that really the only avenue the defense can go with? Because the idea, this level of abuse, there's a reason that caseworker who testified yesterday, Heather Richardson, felt that something was wrong. This is not just coming out of nowhere. The state has built a case here. So the idea that they're making a lot of this up, I don't know if that's going to fly.
No, it's a totally poor tactic, and that kind of approach only works in a he said, she said situation where there's no physical evidence to the contrary. Now, here we have scars on those children's bodies. We have medical reports. So it's not that this is in a vacuum where it's one word against the other. So the fact that the mom is arguing that doesn't bode well in a court of law, especially as you said. I mean, there are boxes upon boxes of evidence, including the medical records these kids endured in the hospital. So you can't argue with that physiology or with the physicality of it. And as well, note that prosecution here is arguing that, or maintaining that the mother herself died on numerous occasions. So we do have a bit of those each side arguing the untruths, but the prosecution is bringing behind it a whole host of physical evidence.
Emily, one of the biggest things in this case is the parents had an issue with the toileting of the 3 kids, okay? They had a big issue with how the kids went to the bathroom. I've heard of abuse before, but this one seems to not make sense. What do you make of it?
When I read the complaint, it struck me almost as if these parents were mad scientists. It struck me that, you know, this is coming again along the heels of the mom arguing that she's a nurse and she has this type of approach to the human body, almost like a science experiment. And you can read in the complaint as it develops in terms of the actual experiments on the children. You know, they didn't start out from the beginning like monsters. It seems to have grown in both detail and in severity. And that's also in part, I think, why the children were so traumatized, because they were essentially conditioned to just respond to these parents and respond to their discipline. But, it started out as normal, and then it began closing out. All of a sudden, they're limiting their bathroom time, they're limiting to the amount of toilet paper they can use. Then it kind of becomes extreme, and they're checking the shower, and there are a whole host of extremely disturbing details surrounding it. But again, I just kept feeling like these kids were treating these girls like Frankensteins. They were experimenting, and it goes on to show how these parents were using tools to explore those girls' bodies, and that's where we get the sexual assault charges as well. And from what I read, it doesn't appear to be a sexual gratification element. It's in part having to do, again, with that kind of exploratory scientific experiment type approach, which is obviously just as unacceptable. But again, it struck me as a very curious, almost totally disattached from the emotional connection you would have with children, or that you would expect here from a parent.
Seems to be more of a power dominance kind of thing, of control over three people. And there's so much to talk about in this case. We're only first dissecting it. We're going to talk about it this morning because we do expect the case to begin again, the trial to begin again at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. For any of us joining, Emily Campagno and I are talking about the Janet Solander case out of Nevada. This woman faces 46 counts of child abuse, ranging from everything from sexual abuse to physical beatings, burnings, extreme cruel punishment, and humiliation in relation to 3 girls that she and her husband later adopted when they were foster kids. It's really a horrific story when you hear about it, and that is what is going on in Nevada. The prosecution, the defense are going back and forth about this case. A lot to talk about here. We're going to go to a short break, and we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law&Crime, everybody. We are covering the Janet Solander case out of Nevada, the woman who is charged with multiple counts of child abuse in relation to 3 foster children that she and her husband later adopted. What I want to play for you right now, in case you missed it, was the opening statement, or part of the opening statement from the state from yesterday, which basically outlines what this woman is accused of. Take a look.
The easiest and most defiant way for a child to vent is by urinating or defecating in his or her pants. This is where the rage can start for foster parents. Rage can all too easily shift into abuse of the child. Ultimately, there is a breaking point, and something bad happens to the child, and then to the foster parent. These words are the words of Janet Solander in a book she published called Foster Care: How to Fix This Corrupted System. There was a lot of rage, and there were a lot of breaking points. And there was hurt, and there was child abuse to these 3 little girls. The 3 little girls you see here were born with the names of Jocelyn, Jacqueline, and Yearly Giselle. And through these little girls, you will learn all about the world of child abuse. You will learn about how they were beaten, physically abused, how implements were used, how their skin broke and they bled, and that they are scarred. But you'll learn more about child abuse, that it's not always physical in nature, that there can be certain terrorizing characteristics or behaviors that can be used against children. The people responsible for the things that I've been talking about that were done to these 3 little girls are the defendant, Janet Solander, and her husband, Dwight Solander, and they're one of Janet's daughters, Danielle Hinton. But before we get into the Solanders, I want to take a minute and talk about these girls before they went to the Solander house. The female you see in this picture is named Debbie McLean. And Debbie was one of the first foster mothers that the girls had. So the girls were taken out of their home of their biological family due to both abuse and neglect. They went to one foster home, and then they went to Miss McLean's home. Miss McLean had worked in and out of social services in the foster care system for the majority of her life. And then when she got close to retiring, her and her husband, who we refer to as Mr. Mack, decided to become foster parents. And so the girls stayed with Debbie and Mack for about a year. And you will hear from Debbie, and Debbie will tell you that while the girls were with her, they were happy little girls, they were healthy little girls, they ate normal foods, there was no problems with their stomachs, no gastrointestinal issues. Debbie will tell you that the youngest, Yaralee Giselle, every once in a while she would wet the bed, but that ultimately the older two girls, and for the most part, Giselle didn't have any types of issues going to the bathroom, or she was making a potty trained. Miss Debbie was not what we refer to as an adoptive resource. She was a true foster parent. She had no intentions. She had already raised her own children. She wanted to be a foster parent until CPS can find placement for children. And these weren't the only foster children that Debbie and Mac had throughout the years. And so basically children would go to Debbie's home, and then when CPS felt like they had found what's referred to as an adoptive resource, then children would move out of the McLean home and into another home. And that's exactly what happened in this situation. The little girls that I've been talking to moved out of Debbie's house and into the Solander's home. And you will hear from many workers from Child Protective Services who had constant contact with the Solanders, that on the outside, they looked like a great fit for foster children. The male, Dwight Solander, worked for a place called Source Refrigeration. He had a contract with Target, and he traveled pretty much weekly. He was out of town a lot. Janet referred to herself and held herself out to be a nurse. That both of them seemed very educated, very well-to-do. They lived in a nice home, and that on the outside, everything looked picture perfect. But it was on the inside where things were really going on. You will hear from Heather Richardson today. She is what's referred to as a CPS permanency worker. She was the permanency worker who worked with Yaralee, Giselle, Jocelyn, and Jacqueline for the entire time that they were in the foster care system, up until they ultimately get adopted by the Solanders. And you will hear from Ms. Richardson, and she will tell you that after what's referred to as the honeymoon period, which is when children are first placed into a home and everybody's excited, the kids are kind of excited to be there, the foster parents are excited to have them, there's this honeymoon period. But then reality kind of sets in for both the children and parents or foster parents, and the honeymoon period is over and people start kind of adjusting to other people's idiosyncrasies. And Heather will tell you that she started getting a little bit concerned. And in fact that she pulled out or pulled away from the adoption idea for a little bit because the defendants started really becoming upset over very minuscule things, especially when it came to the middle child, Jacqueline. And so Heather decided to take a step back, decided to have some meetings with them, and kind of go through some of her concerns. And after Heather did that meeting and a few other meetings, she felt like, okay, I think they get it now, I think we're back on the right track. And ultimately, on January 19th of 2011, the Solanders, Janet and Dwight, adopted these three little girls. They then changed their names, and from this point on, I will refer to them as their adopted names. Yaralee Giselle became Anastasia, Jacqueline became Amaya, and Jocelyn became Anastasia. And then, of course, their last name was changed into Solanders. But it wasn't just their last name that changed. Shortly after becoming adopted is when a lot of the physical abuse started happening. You will hear in this case that from January of 2011 to March of 2014, there were 5 reports and investigations for child
That's some of the
abuse.
prosecution's opening statement in the Janet Solander case out of Nevada. I want to bring in again criminal defense attorney Emily Campagno. Emily, one of the interesting things about this case is the prosecution kind of places the blame on Child Protective Services, saying they could have done more, they could have intervened, but they didn't, and they even put more kids in the Solanders' home. What did you make of that?
It's another failure of the state in these kind of situations. Look, we were talking earlier about the fact that people are depraved, and unfortunately we're going to keep hearing instances of child abuse. That's unfortunately an aspect of human nature. But the point of Child Protective Services, of CPS, and the state's involvement in the foster and adoptive process is to implement a structure that protects these children against these kinds of things. And when it fails, it's the utmost letdown, because what else did these children have? And the fact that these parents went through the foster system, the adoptive process, there were dozens of complaints and calls on these girls' behalf, and it resulted in inactivity by CPS. Now, again, the Janet Solander, the defendant in this case, the mom, she wrote a book against CPS, arguing essentially that their value is minimal and kind of railing against the system. And here they are, ironically proving her point when they failed these little girls. And what's interesting as well is that, we were talking a little bit about the theory of the case here, and the presentation to the jury is in part that each side is maintaining the other was not truthful. So defense here is arguing, oh, these girls, they're making part of it up, etc. That's essentially what the parents here did and said to CPS, and they believed them. And that's partly what in these investigations, it's so crucial for CPS to take these testimony and take these statements from the parents, conduct their investigations separately. It's crucial, because if there's any element of dishonesty or hiding here, it's up to CPS to try to determine what's going on. So these children's stories, they believed her that they were a nurse, believed her about the medical issues. Even the physician went off her word. And of course, there's an element that we do want the system to accept what these parents are saying and develop it further. But it's simply shocking to me, and it shocks the conscience that everything we had in place failed these children. There were 3 years these complaints and calls before these charges were filed. I mean, this was
Emily, they're the forgotten children, right? Isn't that a way of saying it, that they're forgotten children that put into the foster care system? Although, ironically, I don't think anybody's going to be reading Janet Solander's book about the critique of the foster care system anytime soon. I don't think it's on the New York Times bestseller list, but she wrote about it. She wrote about the problems in the foster care system. It's ironic because she's the very problem in the foster care system if she is found guilty.
Exactly. I mean, it's almost in a way reads like a novel where the most vocal person is the one with the most to hide, right? So here she is kind of championing the cause against the system, and look, here's how it fails. And obviously the one who talks the loudest has the most to hide right here in this case. So
well, you talk about that, Emily. You talk about the person who talks the most. The way the prosecution, we just saw it, started their opening statement was a quote from the book that said the problem with urinating, that the foster parents will get angry about these toileting issues, and that's what they're accused of, abuse in regards to the toileting issues. She talked about it in her own book.
Totally. I mean, it almost reads like a manifesto. If anything, it can be brought in as evidence of, look, this is her playbook. I mean, this is her diary. This is her explaining essentially how, again, that rage grew, how she was triggered, and then it kind of developed and morphed into this hideous science experiment with these children. And, for listeners just tuning in, essentially it started out as, again, rage having to do, anger having to do with these kids needing to use the bathroom, and then mushroomed into refusing to let them partake in any kind of normal bodily functions. These girls were so terrified of going to the bathroom that they stopped. It had permanent effect on their physiology and, of course, on their development in terms of their malnourished issues. And then she framed it to the state as, oh, they have dietary issues, we need to blend their meals. Well, their meals decreased from 3 a day to 2, and these are growing young women. And in that book, she discusses it. It is so troubling that CPS did not take further action throughout this, or faster action, frankly. And as you said, I mean, is it the forgotten children? And if so, why isn't there more light shed on it? In this time of collective conscious and collective communication in this world, I mean, and in our nation, you would think that this would be a topic that, as it's shed to light, can somehow make its way onto people's platforms, on the candidates' platforms, and those who have the means to actually affect change, because this kind of sleeper abuse that we're discovering is rampant, is totally unacceptable.
Well, maybe this case will shed some light on it, and that might be the good silver lining in all of this horror. But we keep talking about the prosecution's case and really hammering on Janet Solander, but we live in a country where she is innocent until proven guilty. So the question becomes, Emily, what can the defense do? Is there any value into the argument that these kids might have made more of something than was there? Maybe they needed to be disciplined. Maybe there was they needed structure in their lives, and maybe what they interpreted as abuse, they exaggerated. And the defense says they took, the Solanders took these kids to exams. They, spent money on these kids, and if they really were treating them like worse than human beings, they wouldn't have done that. What do you think about that?
Right. I mean, I think that's kind of a standard defense here, but there are a whole host
I don't know. I thought I did a pretty good job of summarizing it.
You did a great job. Yes, yes. And what I meant by that is just, yes, that was an accurate and good synopsis, but I just meant that they're saying these kids are exaggerating, so they don't know better. Look, we're the parents. We know it's not that bad. But there is an element of normalcy that when woven in is what is so difficult, and what CPS might rely on, frankly, if there's an investigation into their handling of this case of, look, we did all we can by all intents and purposes. It was made clear to us or obvious to us that everything did seem normal, frankly. And remember the House of Horrors situation that we just learned about in Southern California, where those kids were photographed in Vegas at the second wedding, the renewal of vows of the parents,
And Disney World or Disneyland they were at, yeah.
Exactly. So the kids do not have to be kept in a dungeon exclusively for them to have endured terrible abuse. And regardless of the children's veracity, if 99% of the story is inaccurate and only 1% is, that's enough for these dozens of charges against this woman, because there's no amount of abuse should be excused and or not accurately prosecuted in the eyes of the law. So that's another thing to flesh out then with this jury. That's incumbent upon them to determine what elements of the story are true, what elements of this story are as the prosecution is presenting, and then ultimately levy an appropriate sentence.
That's a great point. That's a great point. 46 counts that Janet Solander faces of child abuse. And as you said, the prosecution really just needs to prove one or show a little bit more structure to one, and then things can start unraveling and they might be able to secure conviction here, because the defense said that the prosecution will be unable to prove some of these allegations. That's kind of what I heard from the defense's opening statement, which we'll play a little bit later, is that they might not be able to prove all the allegations, but I'm not sure they're so convinced that the prosecution can't prove at least one. We're going to talk about this case. Again, Emily Campagno and I are talking about the Janet Solander case out of Nevada, where this woman does face 46 counts of child abuse, and the abuse is horrible, ladies and gentlemen. The allegations include sexual abuse, physical beatings, burnings, the use of catheters on children, forcing them to sit on buckets for hours at a time, really, really abusing them in regards to toileting issues. The abuse is so bad that it's hard to even describe, and it doesn't just relate there. There's even allegations that they fed them mice. I wish I could make this up, and I hope none of this is true. And a part of me wishes none of this is true and that the kids are making this up, because this is really horrific if this is in fact what these kids did go through. We are covering the Janet Solander case. We did talk about the Bob Ward case, and I also want to let our viewers know that we will talk about the Donald Smith case a little bit later as well, because that's penalty phase. Remember, he was found guilty of the kidnapping, sexual battery, that's rape, and first-degree murder of Cherish Periwinkle. And now it becomes, for that jury, what will happen to Donald Smith? Will he be sent to jail for the rest of his life, or will he be sentenced to death? It's an interesting case. We're going to follow it here. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We are covering the Janet Solander case out of Nevada, this really, really horrific case of a woman and her husband who have been accused. Well, I should say she has been accused, because he pled guilty to 3 counts of child abuse last month, but she is now on trial for 46 counts of child abuse in relation to 3 foster children that they later adopted. I am going to continue playing for you the prosecution's opening statement from yesterday that kind of outlines what is happening in this case. And when we come back, Emily Campagno and I will talk a little bit about it. Take a look at this.
Or child neglect. And CPS went and investigated, and nothing was done. These children were left in the home, and they were continued to be abused. There will be 3 themes that are constant throughout this case. They revolve around eating, toileting, and this idea that these girls had these gastrointestinal illnesses. And we'll go through these in detail in a moment. You will hear that the girls were originally, they went to regular school, traditional school. And that after they got adopted, Janet became very concerned with their eating. And that there was stuff wrong with their stomach. And so she would go to their school. And she would sit with them, and she would watch what they were eating, and they would be segregated. But after a while, Janet took them out of school and began homeschooling them. The reason she gave for why the children needed to be homeschooled was, number 1, that they were stealing food from the school or from other children from the school. And that number 2, they had so many medical issues that they were medically fragile that she needed to take care of them in their home. Now, as you can imagine, when a child is taken out of traditional school and homeschooled, they then have very limited contact with the outside world. Now, I'm not saying they never went outside. Sometimes they would go grocery shopping. There were a couple of family trips. But for the most part, these children really were kind of confined to this home. They didn't go play out in the front or in the back. They didn't have friends over. And we'll get into kind of their day-to-day treatment in a moment. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is toileting. After the adoption, this became and will continue to be a major issue throughout this entire trial. How it started was this. The girls could not use the bathroom freely. They had to ask to use the restroom. When they would ask to use the restroom, the defendant, Janet Solander, would become angry with them. So in turn, they became scared to ask. So then they would urinate and defecate in their pants. And when they would urinate and defecate in their pants, they would be beaten with paint sticks. When I say that these girls were beaten with paint sticks, we're not talking about a little wooden stick and a little pat on the bottom. They were told to get in the position, which meant get into like a downward dog type position. For those of you that do yoga, your hands and your feet are on the floor, your bottom's up in the air. They were told to take down their shorts and their underwear, and they were beaten with paint sticks. Sometimes to the point that these paint sticks would break in half, and they would continue to be beaten with the broken paint sticks. So there was this constant cycle that these girls couldn't get out of. When they asked to use the bathroom, they got in trouble and got popped in the face for asking. So then they became too scared to ask. So then when they became too scared to ask, they wouldn't ask, and they would ultimately go in their pants. When they went in their pants, then they would be beaten. And they didn't know what to do. And going to the bathroom is something that happens. And so it was this hamster wheel that they could not get off. There were also some abnormal type things. The defendant limited the amount of toilet paper they were allowed to have. It's not like it was just, out and about. No, she limited the amount of toilet paper and they had to ask for it. If they urinated, they were given about 2 to 3 squares of toilet paper. If they went number 2 or defecated, they were given about 6 to 8 pieces of toilet paper. Additionally, to add to this confusion of going to the bathroom, they were timed while they went to the bathroom. And if they didn't finish in time, they got in trouble and sometimes they got beaten. Not only were they timed while they went to the bathroom, they were timed in between going to the bathroom. So let's say you go to the bathroom at 2 o'clock, maybe you're not allowed to go again until 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. So this constant thing of the bathroom just went on and on and on. It got to a point where the little girls, since they were homeschooled, the defendant, Janet Solander's husband, Dwight Solander, went to Home Depot and purchased these orange buckets. I'm sure if you've been to Home Depot, you've seen them. He then bought white toilet seat lids, and place them on the bucket.
You heard the prosecutor just mention another name, Dwight Solander. That is the husband of Janet Solander. I want to bring back in Emily Campagno, criminal defense attorney for This Morning. Dwight Solander pled guilty. Her husband pled guilty last month to 3 counts of child abuse when I think he was up for 36 counts. He pled guilty. They didn't try them together. What do you think the strategy is here? I mean, they were both arrested. And also, I think Janet Solander's daughter, her biological daughter, was arrested in connection with the abuse as well. But why didn't they go for a joint force together, husband and wife being tried together?
You know, ultimately, this is a personal decision of those two, and he might have just decided that it was his personal strategy to accept the deal and move forward. I mean, perhaps this indicates that he accepted the magnitude of responsibility he had for these girls and for their years of abuse, frankly. Now, note that he's going to be sentenced in May, so while we know he has pled guilty to these 3 charges, we don't know yet what he's going to serve, although we know he's facing decades in prison. I mean, cost might have been a factor. Maybe he didn't want to go with a public defender and he didn't have the income. There's so many things that
he couldn't take a plea deal where he would be compelled to testify against his wife because there is that marital boundary. There is that marital privilege that a spouse can't testify against one another. But could he? Will he? What do you think is going to happen?
I think that the simple introduction of his plea in this is sufficient, and I've heard nothing about him breaking privilege to testify against his wife. It's interesting, the gamble of trial is always that. It's always a gamble. And in the deranged approach that both of these individuals had towards their children that would cause them to abuse them, I mean, likely it seems like the mom is just as deranged to think she will get away with this. In part, we've discussed that her strategy is literally saying that these children are making it up.
Yeah.
They are inflaming and totally lying about what we've seen, however, has physiological and physical scars and effects on them. So she's maintaining it didn't happen, that she was in the right. This is the author of a book, an expose on CPS on the issue with the foster abuse system, the problems with it. She's sticking to her guns, but it remains to be seen whether if she's convicted of more than 3 charges, then that was a decision that would have been, that a plea would have covered.
Foster Care, How to Fix This Corrupted System by Janet Solander. What a read. What a read. But again, we're going to have to see what happens to her. Again, we're talking about this case. It's really a disturbing one in the news. Emily Campagno and I are talking about this case, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the other case that I want to bring up this morning, the Donald Smith case that begins again on Tuesday after being found guilty of kidnapping, rape, and murder of 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle. Now his fate is in the hands of the jury in Florida. They have to determine whether or not he should be subject to the death penalty. That is what is at stake for him on Tuesday. We're going to cover it here live on Law&Crime.com, and it's a very interesting case as well. A lot of ones here on the Law&Crime Network. So we have a bunch to talk about here today. You're not going to want to miss anything. We're going to go to a short break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Law&Crime, everybody. As well as a few other cases here on the network, but we're focusing on the Donald Smith case, who was convicted earlier this week of the abduction, sexual battery, that's rape, and first-degree murder of 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle, because on Tuesday begins his sentencing phase. What will happen to him? Will he face the death penalty? Let's bring in again, for our guest for this morning, criminal defense attorney Emily Campagno. Emily, we talked about earlier a little bit, we were starting to get into it, the aggravating and mitigating factors. This guy, from my perspective, and I would say from a lot of viewers, irredeemable, like indefensible. It's so indefensible that his defense really didn't put on much of a defense during his guilt or innocence phase. So what are they going to do during this phase?
I mean, this is where you bring in elements like remorse, you bring in elements like community service, any type of military experience he's had. I mean, it sounds like grasping at straws. As we've been discussing, his behavior throughout the trial, the hubris that he has shown, the audio testimony of him bragging about it, essentially, and kind of that proclivity he has toward young girls, him blaming mothers for letting girls go out looking like that. I mean, it's extremely chilling to listen to. So it's really difficult to in any way balance that, right? I mean, he from what we've seen, he frankly has not shown any remorse. He's not shown any type of sickness that he is now finally imploring the world to get him help. So this is really when you basically look back at anything defense can grasp to at least say,
Hey, Emily,
look,
maybe they'll bring in the inmate that he talked to on the jailhouse recording. That seemed to be his friend. Or maybe his barber. He's got a wonderful mustache. Or maybe his amazing stylist. Maybe these are the people that should talk for him. Because I don't think anybody is going forward. Or maybe, you know what, Emily? I'm sorry. That was supposed to come that never showed up. Maybe his imaginary friend can show up as to speak on his behalf.
Right. Yes. And also, you know, what we clearly see a mountain of here are the aggravating factors. So this girl, and in the state of Florida, what makes it aggravating are, so these are enhancements. And what makes it eligible for the death penalty is the fact that this young girl was younger than 12. That's number one. Secondly, the fact that it was premeditated. So we have him, you know, a very elaborate scheme that he employed to lure this girl out. You know, this wasn't just I just got mad and freaked out, or I happened to abduct her. No, this was a very elaborately planned plan that he employed. He talked to the mother. He made her feel safe. Oh, I would love to help you guys out. My wife will meet us here. Let me help you shop. Let me get you food. He spent considerable time investing and hunting this family and then luring that little girl out, which is part of what is so disgusting about this. Also, note too that in that disturbing audio that we heard earlier, he mentioned Walmart. Like, he mentioned his MO. So it seems, I mean, the premeditation factor here is virtually a slam dunk.
Okay, that I agree with you. But the idea that, and this has been put forward by other people in the network, that if he wants to claim that he has some sort of disease because he is a sexual predator who has had run-ins in the past with the law, all in regards to sexual behavior, lewd behavior, he's a sexual offender, he's been listed as one. Can you put off an argument that he has some sort of disease and couldn't control himself? As upsetting as that is for even me to say, is that something that he might be able to do?
You can certainly try, but look, in a global conceptual approach to that, there is no way that any court will accept essentially placing the blame on an illness for the rape and horribly beating to death and strangulation of an 8-year-old girl for sexual gratification. There's no way that the court is going to start a precedent that then other courts have to follow where he can argue that and therefore, oh, it's not his fault. Now, again, that can be brought in as a mitigating factor. He can bring in all the expert testimony and all the expert psychologists that he wants testify to this, or to propose alternate sentencing. Look, put me in a mental hospital. Look, I'm going to undergo chemical castration. I mean, there are a whole host of trees that crop up when you're dealing with that, but there's no way that the court will justify a murder because someone was, quote, sick.
Yeah, we had a guest on yesterday, and I'm sorry I don't remember who said it, but they made the point that he kind of doesn't want the death penalty at first because he was afraid that he might be put into general population and wouldn't fare too well in prison. Then the question is, if he was put on death row, he would kind of be isolated. So I'm not really sure why he's fighting for this, if that's really what he was scared of.
That whole thing is so ridiculous. Honestly, I'm breaking brand for a second, that I just have to say that nothing irritates me more is disgusting humans who murder and rape others and then have such a palpable fear for their own physical safety. I saw it so many times in my practice, right, in jail and in prison, where these inmates would complain about this and complain about this treatment, or I'm not getting this. I mean, the gall and the audacity, it really chaps my hide. So that's number one. And number two, look, I'm not going to come on here professionally and say that there's not every element that these penitentiaries put in place to protect these inmates, right? And we hear it's become common currency socially to talk about, he's not going to make it and people don't like child molesters. And that's certainly true. But definitely, if he were to be incarcerated, not in death row, and that penitentiary would take all steps possible to protect him and make sure he's not subject to abuse beyond their control, right? But there's also certain things that can happen that they can't control.
Right. Emily and I are talking about what will happen Tuesday during his sentencing phase, and we talk about what the defense may argue. We saw a little bit about how the defense's strategy, or the way that they argue during the defense's opening statement. That's really all we saw. They didn't really cross-examine witnesses that much. They didn't bring out any witnesses in his defense. So let's play you a little bit of how they argued during the defense's opening statement. And remember, the way that they wanted to go, by blaming Rain Periwinkle, they eventually abandoned that strategy because Donald Smith didn't want her cross-examined. But this gives you an indication about how the defense would be moving forward on Tuesday. Let's take a look.
Good morning. We are here in this courtroom because the state of Florida is seeking the death penalty. And you have just heard an emotionally charged opening statement designed to anger you. What we are asking you to do, as Americans in this country, is demand the state of Florida live up to the burden of proof, for they share it alone. Do not make any fixed opinion at this moment, but listen to all of the questioning, including the cross-examination. I will be upfront with you. There will be many people, Mr. Fletcher and I do not cross-examine. We will help you test this evidence that the state brings forward. And unfortunately with that means that we will cross-examination. Rain Periwinkle. For the state told you that she traveled to this area about a mile from her house at about 6:30 at night, knowing that her daughter not only was going to California the next morning, but would have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to make a 6:30 flight. And so she brings these small children, 8 and under, one pushing a stroller, into both Dollar General and Family Dollar. She uses $31 of the $100 that I guess she had allotted and bought miscellaneous things from the home. She decides against a $7 dress for Cherish. And although she will describe the stranger she ultimately entrusts to have watch over her children as creepy, she will tell you that at about 9 o'clock at night, having shopped in these first 2 stores for almost 2 hours, she makes the decision to get into a white van with shuttered windows, no proper seats, and place her children in that van. She goes with a complete stranger to a Walmart over 8 miles away, without any kind of cell phone, without any kind of transportation home, without even having public transportation as an option, for that shuts down at 9 o'clock. And you'll see surveillance tape of where she walks with this stranger and shops for over an hour. And she doesn't flinch when Cherish, and you'll see this with your very own eyes, wanders off with this stranger. Not once, not twice, 3 to 4 times. And she thinks nothing of the fact that this person claims, I'm going to go get cheeseburgers, and Cherish just wanders off. You'll watch the videotape. It will be 39 minutes between when Cherish Periwinkle leaves her mother's sight and 911 is called. You're also going to hear, I anticipate, from 2 people that were married at the time, the Rosiers. They were in, waiting for their father with their little, I believe, newborn baby in the parking lot. And a white van comes over, and they roll down the window, and never having known one another before, this stranger says, "Follow us. We're going to get cheeseburgers." Ultimately, they will come in, and they will identify that stranger. And they will tell you, we don't know if anyone else was in that van, but we literally thought, maybe we do know him, maybe he somehow knows the father they were trying to wait. So they eventually go to McDonald's that's physically outside of Walmart, about 2 miles away. They didn't move them. All of these details will be important, ladies and gentlemen, for you to make legal decisions in this case. On June 22nd, 2013, a beautiful young child lost her life. And I won't mince words, it is horrendous.
So that gives you kind of an indication of how the defense would argue beginning Tuesday in the Donald Smith sentencing phase, even though they didn't really put up much of defense in the guilt or innocence phase. I have to say so long to our guest this morning. She's been great, criminal defense attorney Emily Campagno. Emily, final thoughts on the Donald Smith case, and I know we don't have much time, but I'd like your final thoughts.
Right, this is an interesting case because it really captures in the public view an element of guilt and all of the evidence that is simply stacked against him. The visual and video evidence from that Walmart and the audio evidence from his jailhouse call are simply a slam dunk. And so short, they offer a really horrifying and deep glimpse, frankly, into the level of depravity that he had in terms of his sexual gratification and anger at this girl. So it really is short and sweet, essentially, but this was a slam dunk for prosecution, evidenced by the jury's quick conviction.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much, Emily, for coming on. We can't wait to have you back on.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. So we are covering the Donald Smith case. We are also covering the Janet Solander case out of Nevada. We are going to cover that after this short break. A lot to discuss in that disturbing case. We'll be back in a minute.